Jenlene.
Good morning.
It is very early. I'm still in my pajamas. It's raining outside. It is very dark. We do not have the high production values of ring lights to sustain us, so it's going to be a little bit dark today. But thank you for joining us for this class. Hopefully the audio will be good, even if the video is a bit grainy. So yeah, if you're joining us for the very first time today, welcome. We are currently in Eugene, Oregon. We are on a road trip throughout the Bay Area into Oregon, and Washington.
Yes, visiting all of the warm places and leaving them for the rainy places and wondering why we left the warm, sunny places.
We are currently in a cold, wet place. If you're joining us from whichever country around the world, simply please leave us a comment telling us where you're joining us from. Always makes us very happy. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome. This is an introductory lecture series on Zizek, Lacan, Hegel, Freud, theory, philosophy, and it's designed to be hopefully accessible, intuitive, maybe even a little bit fun. And for the past year and a half, I've been teaching these classes for free, open access for anybody who wants to join. Jenlene tends to hang out with us because that makes it more fun for me, and it's just sort of nice sharing our thoughts together. The only reason that we can keep doing this for free is because we have the support of our patrons from around the world. So a big thank you to our patrons, our global learning community. If you'd like to download all of these classes as a podcast and get bonus content for every single class to help you in your studies, please click the link in our bio and consider becoming a patron today. It really makes a very big difference. In fact, Instagram has a new feature where you can now make payments in the live stream, and we've decided not to do that because we want these live streams to feel open access and really truly feel like they're available for everybody. But if you like these classes and you would like to show us a little bit of financial support and join our community on Patreon, please consider becoming a patron today. All right. I think we should just sort of launch right in.
Yeah.
Again, apologies for the dark, very, very dark screen. We're going to try to lighten your moods through this. So Jenlene and I, also if you're joining for the very first time, you should know that these classes are taught in an old-fashioned, quote-unquote, dialectical manner. Now, what is dialectical teaching? Dialectical teaching means that we're not just trying to transfer information. We're not just trying to say, here's a summary of the best that has been thought and done in human history. That would be a normative way of teaching. Dialectical teaching instead has a very different flow, where we introduce different elements, different ideas, and throughout the course of the next hour, and throughout the course of the series, you will find that those ideas spontaneously start linking up together in your own mind. And the goal of dialectical thought and dialectical theory is that rather than saying, I am the authority giving you the information, you are in fact the person who is making the synthesis, and you are the one coming up with the original ideas. And so hopefully these classes will give you little nuggets that can inspire your own thoughts. That is the goal here.
Or to create a new vocabulary or framework of ideas to help you make sense of something that you already experience or comes up in your own life, but is like a new way to think about them.
Exactly, yeah.
Or to realize that other people have had the same problems or ideas or frustrations maybe that you've had. Yeah, that's part of the goal, I think, in making this a learning community, is to say that the learning process can be a lonely one, but you are not alone in that process, I guess is what I'd say.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. I really believe that's very true.
And the voice in the car with you.
Well, and also that we often use examples from movies and opera and music, and we try to link them together in a way. Okay, so let's just simply begin. And if you're joining us, please do leave a comment telling us what country you are joining us from. We do really enjoy seeing that come on our screen. Okay, so Jenlene and I have been going to a lot of performances, a lot of concerts, and one of the concerts we went to was a Mozart opera. This was in San Francisco. We went to the Opera House, and we went to a Mozart concert, which is called?
Cosi fan tutte.
Cosi fan tutte. Do you know what Cosi fan tutte sort of means?
No, I don't know what it literally means. I usually see it translated as like the sport of love or the game of love.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that it is translated as the game of love, which is like the subtitle to the opera. So technically it means they do it all, or they all do it. And by they is implied women. Basically the title means all women are like this.
Yeah.
essentially. Cosi fan tutte. And I know that you don't like doing exposition, but could I ask you to very briefly give us like a very quick like
Two women.
plot synopsis?
Two women, and their fiancés are joined usually at like a hotel or a resort or some sort of place where a manager makes a wager with the two fiancés, the men, saying, your women are not as faithful to you as you think they are. And if I am right, I will win some money, and if I am wrong, I will give you some money. And the men take them up on the wager and leave as though they have been called to military service, but return in very convincing disguises and switch partners and seduce the other woman with varying degrees of success or lack of success.
Yeah, very nice. That's
And,
excellent.
and marry as the switched partners.
Well, it depends on how it's staged,
Yes.
whether or not they marry. Yeah,
Yes.
but exactly.
Okay.
Yes, you're exactly right. We have
the
two
salient details.
two men who are in love with two women, and as a test of their lovers' fidelity, they decide to each seduce the other woman in disguise, essentially.
Yes.
And there's a lot to be said about this that is philosophically interesting, and we're going to dedicate a little bit of time to talking about Cosi fan tutte, the Mozart opera. First of all, when it comes to manipulation is very similar to seduction, and here's why. I'm not saying that seduction is a form of manipulation. Instead, manipulation and seduction follow a similar trajectory, which is that technically, manipulation is only successful if we don't know we're being manipulated. In other words, if you know you're being manipulated badly or poorly. The same is true for seduction. Technically, if you're being seduced, it seems like you're the one who is doing the falling in love.
Right.
And if you're aware of the other person seducing you, you're being seduced poorly. In other words, you probably don't like the way they're coming onto you. However, is this really true? I would say it isn't. The underlying Lacanian, perhaps even Sadian dimension here is that we want to be deceived. We want to be manipulated. We want to be seduced. And so the way that real good manipulation functions is that it gives us just enough awareness of us being manipulated for us to feel superior. This is a classic trick even when it comes to magicians. Magicians don't just fool you. Magicians give you the illusion of seeing through it, and it's exactly in the moment where you feel like you see through the trick that they're able to fool you. The same is true when it comes to seduction. Real seduction isn't, I have genuinely convinced you or tricked you into falling in love with me. Seduction is, I've given you just enough power, just enough insight into how pitifully bad I am at seduction, at which point I have actually succeeded in successfully seducing you. In other words, both in manipulation and seduction, we have, in a sense, a form of double, a form of repetition, which is that the success arrives only through the form of its perceived failure. You manipulate someone at the exact point that they think they've seen through your manipulation, and you seduce someone at the exact point that they think that they're the one in charge because you're trying to seduce them.
I feel like this is sort of the formula for most rom-coms as well, is the woman feels as though she sees through the seduction, and it's only when the seduction appears to fail that she realized that all along he was the right person for her. Yeah.
Right? And the funny thing is that a lot of people who look at seduction, they say something like, it's a numbers game. You just talk to enough women or enough men and someone will like submit to you. But the funny thing is that what they fail to recognize is that yes, seduction is about repetition, but not about repetition between different people. Seduction is specifically about repetition with one person, which is also another way of saying dating, for example. Okay, so there's already an element here, an element of repetition, and a repetition by which something turns into its seeming opposite. You could say something similar happens with the difference between cynicism and irony. And I have a theory about Cosi fan tutte, which Zizek has written about as well. So I shouldn't say it's entirely my own theory. I mean, Edward Said has written about this well. Like, every leftist at some point has written about Cosi fan tutte.
Well, because it's a totally open-ended ending, and that's fairly unusual in opera.
Again,
More common in comedies and theater, I suppose. Yeah.
I suppose, again, it depends a little bit on which staging.
Yes.
So what do you mean by open-ended?
I mean, the ending, the resolution of the couples, whether they become joined, whether they fall in love with a new couple, whether they despair and walk off in disgust, is all about the staging. It's not in the music.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I'll get back to the different versions of it in a little bit, I think, which is interesting. So one of the interesting things about Cosi fan tutte is that we see a shift within the genre of romantic opera. And Cosi fan tutte is essentially a post-romantic opera, which is another way of saying that it is an ironic opera. And ironic in a very strict sense of the word. If you want to understand the difference between irony and cynicism, they basically work as inversions of each other. Cynicism, to be a cynic, is to essentially publicly state a belief and yet to privately mock it. For example, a politician who might speak of the great virtues of the people and of the fatherland might, in his clubhouse, say terrible things about his own country or about the people or about the fatherland. In other words, they're performing sincerity only so as to privately be insincere. That is what cynicism is. Irony actually works the other way around. And one of the beauties is that irony is itself ironic, which is that irony is to publicly profess your skepticism and yet privately to still believe. To say, oh, I don't believe in such a thing as the people. I don't believe in such a thing as the fatherland. I don't believe in such a thing as the nation. And yet secretly you're upset because you still desperately want to believe. And so cynicism and irony function as two sides of the same coin. Cynicism is the process by which you publicly profess belief and yet privately disavow it. And irony is where you publicly disavow your belief and privately avow it. And something similar happens within Cosi fan tutte. Cosi fan tutte is essentially an ironic opera because it disavows publicly the romantic core of all romantic operas, which is the arias of huge outbursts of feeling, the romantic sincere form, like Verdi, for example, where it's just like, oh, da, 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 you know, like that. And Mozart can't bring himself to do this. And so those arias that I think are part of like Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3 are actually quite terrible. They're quite boring. They're almost like ironic because the lovers are doing these big gestures, except it's part of the trick. And so we have a distance towards the formal content of the romantic aria that is embedded in the work, which is a very modern gesture in a sense. We're enjoying the process that there's a meta-narrative at work. Oh, there's two lovers who are falling into this romantic passion, and yet we as an audience know it's fake. And of course, one of the two lovers knows it's a fake as well.
And that's part of the reason why the most popular character in the opera is neither the lovers, who are always confused with each other, but rather...
You mean Alfonso?
Alfonso and Despina.
Oh, yeah.
The maid and the manager are the true romantic couples because in a modern sense they are the most, we might say, realist.
I just want to point out that there's like some deer passing by our car, a lot of wildlife.
I thought they might be behind us. And you can see them out
I don't
the
think
window,
you can
but
see it.
I think you can see them.
No, you actually went exactly with where I was going. So we have two, apart from the two couples in Cosi fan tutte, we have Alfonso and Despina. Who arrange this entire game. And of course, one of the contemporary modern sort of psychoanalytic readings is that the true protagonists are Alfonso and Despina. In fact, they are lovers.
This is a regular, trick in opera. The other really classic case is in Turandot, the sort of, the most sympathetic character is Lulu, and and she's sort of a side character, and yet Puccini knows to give her the most soaring music, and she usually is the most sympathetic character, not sort of the romantic lead. Yeah.
But what makes it ironic again in Mozart is that Alfonso and Despina, who are manipulating the couples, this is, you could say, this is their foreplay. They enjoy manipulating other people's love because they don't have direct access to their own love. There's another layer of ironic distancing that happens there, I think. Okay, so I know we're still talking a lot about Cosi fan tutte, but that's just something that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So we're talking here a little bit about why Mozart's opera Cosi fan tutte is essentially ironic. On one level, it's ironic because it allows a certain distancing from the romantic staging, the romantic aria, etc. But you also have to understand here that within the duo of irony versus cynicism, we also have another duo, another binary, between the aesthetic and the ethical. And here's the funny thing. A lot of people have condemned Cosi fan tutte as being an unethical opera. In other words, it's showing, how even the title is unethical. It's saying women are all unfaithful, and I mean, it doesn't say they're unfaithful. It's ambiguous. But
and part of it, I think, is that the women capitulate when there's the threat of violence, and that is uncomfortable. I find that uncomfortable.
Is it unethical?
I don't know.
Because I agree with you, but I think that's already a different argument.
Yeah.
Because the unethical argument is the people who are stuck in the romantic operas. They say, we want pure formal romance, and so we don't like an opera that shows people acting virtuously, non-virtuously, people who are seducing each other, etc. And so what I'm trying to point out here is there's a difference between the aesthetic and the ethical. The aesthetic is very much within the realm of the romantic opera. In other words, the aesthetic is trying to capture a moment of the sublime in like this timeless sequence. In a sense, a photograph is in that sense aesthetic, right? A photograph, like you could say, what is it? The two lovers after like World War II, the soldier and the woman.
Yeah, the Times Square, the soldier grabs the woman. Yeah.
These are like romantic aesthetic photographs because they try to have like this larger than life moment of romance that takes place. You could also look at we saw this the other day, Rodin's statue of the kiss. The kiss is the aesthetic. The kiss is that moment of a couple eternalized in the romantic embrace. Ethical is the opposite of aesthetic in that sense. Aesthetic is one moment that symbolizes an eternal principle. Ethical has to be the repetition of moments that in their sum become a principle. In other words, to act ethically isn't to act one time. To act ethically is to act consistently with a principle. In other words, if we apply this to love, we realize that we have already a problem, which is that romance is distinctly not ethical in its very core. Romance in its sublime, immediate, I just want to wrap myself around you, embrace is a fleeting moment of the principle of love itself. Whereas the ethical is the repetition of living up to that principle, which is another word for marriage. In other words, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
In other words, in a sort of ironic way again, you could say that marriage is the neutering of the aesthetic element of love into the higher principle of the ethical element of love. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Which isn't a bad thing, but here's the funny thing is,
Yeah, but that's also why marriage is talked about as being the death of romance, that it's the formalization, it's the end of one thing and the beginning of ritualized or habitual or what you're calling ethical behavior. Yeah.
Well, and what's funny there is that that's often presented as like, a loss. But it's also specifically a loss that is its own gain. And we talked about this a lot last week with Orpheus and Eurydice. If you want to go back to last week's class, we did a long take on love and marriage and Greek mythology. What's interesting here, I mean, there's a lot of interesting points here, I guess, that we can say about Cosi fan tutte. But there's this aspect to which what the characters are afraid of is precisely this transition from love as the aesthetic ideal towards love as the ethical embrace. Because what's important to remember is that Alfonso even arranges the fact that they are with the women to begin with. He's already manipulated their first encounter. In other words, they're aware that their encounter was manipulated. And so how does that become formulated into true love, into marriage? And in a weird way, and like Zizek has pointed out that this is essentially Hegelian negation of negation, which I think is a little bit fanciful, but okay, is that they have to manipulate their spouses in order to forget that they were themselves manipulated. And that's how the entire Cosi fan tutte works. The men are manipulating their partners by seducing them. But of course, the game of seduction, what you referred to as the game of love, is itself a manipulation of Alfonso. And so what happens in a psychoanalytic sort of Lacanian way is that the men's pleasure, which begins as the pleasure of falling in love, becomes the pleasure not just of humiliating their partners, but weaponizing their partner's love against themselves. And that's what's ironic again about the opera, which is that it's not just that they're trying to seduce the women or to prove that the women are, women, etc., or that they don't have ethics or morals. It's specifically that they want to use the women's natural desire for their partner, in other words, true love, against them. And so it's actually trying to undermine true love from within. And in that sense, of course, Cosi fan tutte is properly ethical, because it's taking the true love romance and trying to turn that into a repetition of its perceived opposite. And the irony, and this is the Hegelian irony, is that it's only through the repetition of the perceived opposite of the initial encounter of love that they do, in the sense, end up together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's that continuation, creates that continuation.
So there's a couple of different ways that the opera has been staged. And it's always difficult to stage the opera because of all the ambiguity that goes on in it. And there's even been versions where they've just played the music and they've just let out like the rest, It's funny because there's some people today who go to church who aren't there because they're not there for the service. They just say that they're in the church for the music because they like the music, but they don't like, the gospel or the ritual or the dogma, etc. And that's sort of what a lot of people have done to Mozart, is they say, we'd like to have Mozart just for the music, but not for the content. Mm-hmm. There's actually something very revealing. This is something that I didn't know about until Zizek mentioned it, that Edward Said had mentioned it. So this is like 3 stages of removal. I think I actually read it in Said as well. Said has really interesting, Edward Said, who we know mostly from Orientalism, has interesting opinions on opera. One of them is that, Edward Said is no longer with us, but he would have hated the idea of virtual performances. He was a very, very strong critic of the idea of like the New York Opera's live broadcasts
televised
and stuff like that. Anyway, so Said points out that Mozart has a letter. So this is me pointing out that Zizek points out, that Said points out, that Mozart points out. We have here 4 stages of removal. Mozart writes in a letter to his partner while he's working on Cosi fan tutte that if only people could see into his own heart, if only they could see into his heart, they would know what he is truly feeling. And at this point, we think that he's going to reveal something, like, romantic gesture. If they could only see into my heart, they would know that my heart is torn asunder, etc. And instead, he actually says the exact opposite. Mozart says, if only they could see directly into my heart, they would know that I feel nothing. And this is like, to go back to like the difference between the cynic. Here we have Mozart the cynic, who publicly professes belief and yet says there's nothing underneath it, who of course is the master of the ironic opera, which is the reversal of that, which is the publicly professing not to believe, but underneath there is true love. Mm-hmm. And so it's a redemption of Mozart's own cynicism, is in a sense to be ironic. And this is what's important here, and you can draw too many conclusions from it, but one of Cosi fan tutte's messages is that we should be very suspicious of the idea of the romantic encounter. not because that person could be seduced to love somebody else. That's not the point. The point is that the romantic encounter, the falling in love by itself, isn't the actual thing. Falling in love doesn't lead to love necessarily. Love is the formalization of that fall into something that appears to be antithetical to the fall itself, where we take the formal content of falling in love, which is perceived as a loss of worldly content, that has to then be reformalized into a formal content of what love is in the world. Now, if you relate that to the idea of belief, for example, like this is something that Zizek has written about a lot, like Pascalian belief. When you pray, you're not praying, and we talked again about this last week quite a bit. When you're praying, you're not just praying as if it were real. In other words, belief isn't just belief in belief itself. Belief is also distinctly belief for the other. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you perform belief as if it were real, it doesn't become real to you, but it becomes real to the other. And if enough people do this, it becomes real to the other people around them as well. Now, we immediately start thinking about virtue signaling here. Because one of the critiques of virtue signaling is that it means nothing. That if you post a black square on, on your social media to demonstrate something about like Black Lives Matter, that is not going to affect structural racism in our society. That's the obvious criticism. But again, here we have to be suspicious of the cynical take versus the ironic take. The cynical take would be to say, essentially, yes, I believe that we should end racism, but I don't believe we can. Which is what a lot of people who are against virtue signaling say. Oh, you have good intentions, but don't you know this affects nothing? The ironic stance is, again, secretly more powerful. The ironic stance is actually to say something like, well, I don't believe this will have an effect, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Do it anyway, yes.
Which is exactly what then virtue signaling becomes. Now, let's make an argument in defense of virtue signaling for a moment. I know not a lot of people do this, but ironically, again, in the technical word of irony, it's actually Immanuel Kant who makes a defense of virtue signaling. Immanuel Kant writes that virtue is like small change. You can't buy anything with it, and yet you wouldn't have money without it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I can't believe that that's not an inspirational quote. Virtue signaling is like loose change.
Loose change, yeah, exactly, like loose change. But Kant is also making a bigger argument here, Immanuel Kant, which is an argument about morality. Kant says that the problem with virtue and demonstrations of virtue, in other words, virtue signaling, the problem isn't that it means nothing. Everybody knows, in a sense, that virtue by itself isn't the same thing as the good, the greater good. The problem is when we look at virtue signaling and we convince ourselves that we are, in fact, virtuous. In other words, the cynical stance to dismiss virtue signaling secretly believes that you, the person who sees through it, are the only good person left. And that is what Kant says is dangerous, because Kant then says, in a prefiguration of Hegel's evil resides in the gaze that sees evil everywhere. In other words, evil is simply the person who completely is committed to the idea that they are good. The cynic becomes evil precisely because the cynic believes that everybody else is virtue signaling and they're the only real good person because they're not virtue signaling.
Well, and because they see through the virtue signaling. So maybe the way to re-imbue virtue signaling with power is the signaler says, I know that this is an impotent gesture, and yet I do it anyway.
Yeah. And the cynic has a fundamental error of recognition, which is the cynic looks at social media and sees everybody virtue signaling and says, how can these idiots actually believe this is going to change? But of course, nobody actually believes that it's going to change. And this is where Kant says that virtue actually functions very similar to love. Kant says that if you behave virtuously, even if you are faking it, you will become virtuous. For example, Kant says that it doesn't matter whether you hate your neighbor. If you treat your neighbor well, your neighbor will be treated well. And in a sense, we're back at we're prefiguring the Freudian theory of the neighbor, which again is for Lacan becomes the theory of the other, which is that Freud says that the person we hate the most is our neighbor. There's nobody we hate as purely as the neighbor, precisely because they are not an acquaintance. A neighbor resides in the formal other. A neighbor is the person on the other side of the wall. We don't actually have to get to know the neighbor, and so we can enjoy hating the neighbor. In the same way, this is strictly analogous to the fact that we can only purely love somebody we do not know. In other words, the hate that you feel for your neighbor is not that different from the Christian love for the neighbor. Love your neighbor like you love thyself becomes hate your neighbor like you hate thyself. It is only in the pure, because the neighbor exists only in the figuration in your own imagination. The neighbor is not a real person. The neighbor is a true other in that sense. And of course, this is exactly how ghost stories work, where like somebody is buried in the wall or something. Like they don't actually have to be there in order to exist in your head. Now, the point I'm trying to make here, because I realize that we're getting a little bit in the woods here. Again, dialectical teaching, this is my cop-out. The point I'm trying to make here is that, remember, I was saying that belief functions not as a performance for you, but on the level of the other. Belief is performance for the other. There's actually a TikTok video of, I don't remember what the guy's called, but he like auto-tunes his own stories. And he has a story where he talks about being part of a evangelical church growing up. And one of the things that his church did was that they would speak in tongues every once in a while. And he didn't really believe in speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues, I've talked about this before, is the process of like speaking in a way that cannot be made sense of. St. Paul calls speaking in tongues speech that is indiscernible to man and only discernible to God. Basically, it's gibberish, right? It's yabba blah blah blah, whatever. And he says that, the TikToker says that as a child, he was in church, and one day he decided that he was going to pretend to speak in tongues. And so when the pastor like invoked people to speak in tongues, he went shamala, shamala. And he said that around him, people were like, oh my God, it's happening. He's speaking in tongues. And they all started crying and screaming. And he started crying and screaming. And he says that that was the moment at which he realized that he was not made for the church. Because he felt that he had essentially staged a fake tongues. And everybody else believed it. Thus, the church was hypocritical. However, the dimension that is missed here is that in a weird way, he, in his very cynicism, is the true believer. He is the one who believes that speaking in tongue is a quote-unquote real moment of I have been identified by God for divine ecstasy. That is the cynic's belief. The public profession, shamalabala, but privately, oh, this is why I don't believe in God anymore. And of course, the church functions in a much more ironic way, which is that the only way that belief is formalized is precisely through this isn't really happening, but we're doing it anyway. That is the miracle of belief. That is what is called faith. And so what's a little bit sad and a little bit ironic about that story, and I'm not trying to defend evangelical churches here, many of which can be deeply abusive and horribly manipulative, which is true for many instances of faith.
Most institutions.
Yeah.
Generally.
Is that moment of I am just saying this and everybody else is following me as if it were real, that is the core content of the church. And of course, he's right to say that you have a subjective right at that point to say, either I embrace it or I walk away from it. But something very similar happens on the level of society, to go back to Kant and to the idea of virtue. There's a beautiful scene in one of my favorite comedy TV shows. It's a British show called Peep Show. You know what I'm going to say, right? And in Peep Show, the narrative device of Peep Show is that we always hear the internal monologue of the characters. And there's an episode where one of the adult characters decides to sneak into university. As in, he always wanted to study history, but he never actually went to study history. And so he realizes that campuses are open. And so he could technically just walk into a lecture hall. Like, it's very unlikely that somebody is going to kick you out of the lecture hall just for showing up. In fact, when I was at university, this was a problem because universities had started buying giant widescreen televisions for every classroom. talk about like first world education, none of which were used very much except to like, and
An opportunity
what would
for
happen would be that
the inevitable.
would be some thieves would walk onto campus with a backpack, grab a TV, walk away, and leave. Because that's sort of what privilege is you don't have to come up with an Ocean's 11 heist. It's not money heist. Instead, you just show up, you take the thing, and you leave, and you just pretend like you're supposed to be there. This is how all white-collar criminal acts work, is you just have the audacity to say, this is mine.
This is now mine.
And so the universities had this whole problem, which is why then they needed key cards, etc. Anyway, to go back to Peep Show. Yeah,
Maybe just don't buy TVs.
Yeah. I mean, there's an argument to be made that the most valuable thing on a college campus should be the professor's brain. But anyway. So
Peep Show.
Peep Show, the UK British comedy show Peep Show, a character decides to quote unquote steal education, to go onto campus and to partake in a history lecture. And he walks into a small room, it's like a seminar, where the professor is sitting and there's like 6 other students and him. And the professor says, "Who are you? I've never seen you." And he sort of stutters, I just enrolled, blah, blah. And the professor's like, "Yeah, whatever, okay, fine."
I don't care.
I don't care. And the scene then sort of goes mute, and we have the internal monologue of the guy who's stealing education. And he's like, he's having an existential crisis. Instead of enjoying the fact that he is now in a history seminar.
He's fulfilling his lifelong dream of being a history student.
Yeah, instead of inhabiting his own dream, he suddenly realizes how hollow the entire situation is. And so he thinks to himself, wait, is the entire world just rooms with people walking in as if they were supposed to be there and then pretending like this is real life? And he basically has like a psychological breakdown, not because his crime failed, but because his crime was too successful. And
it is hysterical.
it's a beautiful scene because in a weird way he learns the traumatic kernel. The lesson he learns is the traumatic content of history itself, which is history isn't just what is in the books. History is what happened by people who happened to be in the room and had to pretend like they were supposed to be there, which gives us a very different dimension on the whole Hamilton, the people in the room.
In the room, yeah.
The people in the room aren't like the powerful people who have access to the table. The people in the room are the people who have access to the traumatic dimension of power, which is that once you're at the table, there is just a table. And yeah, you were going to say?
Well, and this is just, I mean, as an aside, like this was something that was really difficult during the pandemic, is part of being an academic, especially a precarious academic, in the sense that your contract is term by term, year by year, is you have to constantly be present because you never know what meetings are going to be happening that you should be at. And the number of times you and I have both been grabbed and pulled into a meeting, not because we needed to be at the meeting, but something ultimately ended up impacting us in a very significant way, is really, for me, was always kind of devastating because it shows how contingent it is.
I would argue the exact opposite, if you'll allow me, which
Yes,
is that
please.
I think that most meetings don't need to happen. Most people who, someone asks us to move the phone. People,
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Do you want to see the deer? The deer is also just like
Lounging.
chilling
I don't
in the
think
yard.
you could see it from here.
It's very happy.
We could
No,
try, but
sorry.
I don't
No,
think you
it's
could see
okay.
it. Most meetings don't have to happen. In fact, that was the lesson of the pandemic, I think, was the exact opposite. Or I mean, maybe I misinterpreted you, which is that most of the time a meeting doesn't have to exist. Most of the time meetings take place with an organization simply so that you can say we had a meeting about it.
Yeah, to formalize what's already been
Yeah,
decided.
to put people there. Yeah, anyway. So the point here, I mean, I am trying to make like a philosophical point,
Yes.
which is the following. This traumatic dimension is what Lacan would call the real. This is the real of power. The real of power is not that at a certain point you have power and you wield it. The real of power is at a certain point you realize that there is nothing to power. That, in a weird way, it is just you in a room wielding said power. And I think what happened in the pandemic, and I think this has happened many times before, is that we start realizing how formally empty power is in that sense. And what's dangerous there is that you can have, again, a cynical response and an ironic response. The cynical response would be to say, well, I believe in the almighty content of power, but secretly I know it's empty, which is what most politicians do. Politicians say we can do anything, but secretly we don't think we can do anything. This is also how reactionary change works. Reactionary change is always cynical, which is why we should never be cynical. Cynicism is reactionary because a reactionary wants to change everything in order for everything to stay the same. Irony has a more revolutionary content here. It's also why laughter is revolutionary and cynicism isn't. The idea of irony is to say, we don't believe that power has any formal content. And yet when we use our power, you'd better watch out. In other words, it's because we know that power is formally empty that we can exercise it to its most extreme. That is also, in a sense, the irony, the cruel irony of revolutionary terror and the sort of like the awful, horrific, dehumanizing element of that. Stalinist violence was never cynical. Hitler's violence was cynical. Hitler's violence was, this is the necessary final solution we have to take in order for everything to change the same. Hitler's violence, any violence coming from the Holocaust, as horrific as it is cynical violence. It's the violence of, this is what has to be done in order for everything to be the same. We profess this. Which isn't to say that the Nazis didn't actually believe in what they were doing, but they believed that it was the necessary thing that had to be done. This is the cynical dimension even within the Kantian imperative, the, du kannst denn du sollst. The ironic violence is Stalinist violence, which is, none of this means anything, and yet you're now dead, basically. Everything can change on a dime, and we have two very different dimensions here. Now, what does that tell us about Cosi fan tutte and about love? Love has the same traumatic dimension that power has, which is that love, once you are in love, is the same thing as finally being in the room. Wait, this is it? We've structured our entire artistic, aesthetic, emotional, revolutionary narrative on love, and it's just this? Love seems shockingly ordinary when you experience it. And a lot of people run away from love at the exact point that they realize that love is that. This goes back to something that Zizek has always said about Freud. Zizek has always said, the Freudian question is not, why is everything about sex? The Freudian question is, what is sex about? The same thing can be said for love. Remember, let's say that you're having a romantic encounter. Mm-hmm. You try to, in the classic romantic narrative of the aria, you say, your love is like my love for you is like flowers, and it's undying, and it's this, and it's figurative exchange. Mm-hmm. My love for you is X, all these other beautiful things.
Yes.
The question then is, what is love without that figuration?
Right.
And what's weird is that what Cosi fan tutte understands, which is why Cosi fan tutte is not cynical, but is ironic, is that Cosi fan tutte's radical message is that love is nothing other than the misrecognition of love itself. In other words, Alfonso and Despina are having pleasure by denying their own love and manipulating the other lovers. The two men are having quote-unquote love by denying their love and manipulating their partners. And the women, depending on how you stage it, are enjoying their own manipulation because, of course, they've seen through the disguise from the very moment it started, because you can't just put on a mustache and pretend to be Albanian, as what they do in the, right?
I love that even in Mozart's time, there were, like, fake mustaches, fake disguises.
Yeah.
I want to know. Anyway.
And so what's weird is that everybody is having a very intense, possibly even, like, sexualized experience through a disavowal of the formal content of love itself. Which is why, to go back to your original point, in Mozart's Cosi fan tutte, the ending is in a weird way a failure, or at least it's open. Because what comes next, the like everything like sort of clicking, the formalization of love, is inherently less potent than what that was, the game of love.
Right.
Now, it's interesting here to look at the inspiration for Cosi fan tutte's, for Mozart's opera. And of course, there's many different inspirations. I mean, this is a theme that is being done in Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew, for example, but also Ovid and medieval, farces, etc. There's a version of it in Ovid where we have essentially, I need to remember what the characters' names are. I always find these Greek names a little bit hard to remember. What are they called again? I think I wrote it down somewhere. Ovid basically has a story about two lovers. I'll remember the name. Someone can help me. A man and a woman. And also Ovid being the Roman poet, by the way. Metamorphoses, etc., right? Two lovers. A man and a woman. The man goes away on a trip to quote-unquote test the woman, to test her fidelity. However, this is like a scientist putting his fingers on the scale. Because the man doesn't just leave the woman and says, okay, I'm going to wait and see what happens. Because what if the woman is not seduced? In a sense, the experiment would have failed. And so the man does the scientific thing, which is that he himself decides to seduce the woman as if he were someone else to test her. There's a lot of sexist stories here, but sexist in other ways than we might expect. Yeah, you were gonna say?
No, I have too many thoughts.
I want to hear your thoughts. No, please do.
Well, first of all, I love the idea, like, what if he fails? What if he is unable to seduce her and she realizes that he's not worth it and she leaves him, which seems like sort of the logical outcome. Or he is successful and then it just feels like a way to end the relationship.
Yeah.
I'm unhappy with this relationship, so I'm going to sabotage it by subjecting it to the scientific method.
There's a lot of dead ends here.
Yes.
But again, there are ways to avoid the formal content of love. Again, if we think of love as traumatic, in the same way that when you walk into a room of power, you realize that power is just people in a room, there's a certain traumatic element to love, which is you realize, oh, this is just what it is when two people are in love. And so we can see this whole narrative of the man stepping away to test his true love's authenticity as a very easy escape from the fact that the man doubts his own love. And this is, of course, what happens in a lot of relationships. Like, I don't want to be like a pop psychologist here, but like, the easiest way to avoid the question, do I really love you, is to accuse the other person of not really loving you. Yeah. Because it's an easy out. Because if they don't love you properly, if they've cheated on you, then you don't have to have responsibility for the fact that you might not love them properly.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is that Mozart is also really interested in the resolution of love stories. So one of his other famous operas is The Marriage of Figaro, because Figaro was a very beloved opera character from The Barber of Seville, right? Rossini composed The Barber of Seville, and it was a very successful opera. And Mozart said, what happens to Figaro? What happens when he's married? And so we have the opera, 20 years later, where the romantic lead of The Barber of Seville, whose name I can't remember, has become sort of this old, no longer loves his wife, is unhappy, Figaro is unhappy, what happens when all of these characters, the curtain comes down in a sense? What happens to these characters? It's a wonderful opera. I love Mozart. But.
Yeah, it's important again to note here that Mozart is in a sense like post-romantic, right? He's put off by the romanticism of those. Actually, really, Barber of Seville is one of my favorite operas because of and this is something that I've talked about before, the narrative device of the useless precaution, which is a form of a vanishing mediator.
But that's Rossini. See, I need to take you to see The Marriage of Figaro. Julian has never seen
The Marriage of Figaro. I have. No, I saw a live stream of it. You took me to one.
I take it all back?
Yeah. It was years ago.
Anyway, sorry. I didn't mean to say
maybe I'm living the Marriage of Figaro. When you met me, I was like a seducing barber.
No, you're thinking of The Barber of Seville.
I like Barber of Seville. It's my favorite.
Anyway, sorry.
The opening bars of The Barber of Seville are still my favorite.
They go.
It's like Super Mario, basically.
You know how the Marriage of Figaro opens? He is measuring his room because he wants to make sure his new marital bed will fit in the bedroom.
I do remember that. Yeah.
That's a great.
Very sexy. Very sexy.
Okay, let's get back on track.
Yeah. So the point here was that I was talking about one of the Ovid's influence for Cosi fan tutte, for the opera, and that one of the influences was the Ovid, basically. There's different versions of Ovid's story, which is kind of interesting, but one of the classic versions of the story is the man leaves the woman to test the woman and seduce her, essentially. He returns in disguise to seduce her. He does seduce her, but they are reconciled and they become a happy couple. Part two is that he tends to go hunting a lot. And we're sort of like in a Brokeback Mountain type situation where the woman starts suspecting that while he is out hunting, he's being unfaithful to her. This is where we have two different versions, at least two, there's like 3 or 4 different versions of the story. The straight up version of the story is that she hears that he is sleeping with a like minor goddess of the wind, like a deity of the wind. And she finds out that he is in fact doing this, and to obscure his crime, he kills her. Sad ending. But there's an older version of that story that is actually much more interesting to me, which is that she suspects that he is sleeping with the wind goddess. And so while he is out hunting, she secretly follows him in the woods. Then she realizes that he is invoking the goddess to aid him in his hunt. In other words, to guide his arrow straight. And in her moment of relief that she has discovered that he is not in fact cheating on her, she jumps out of the bushes and says, "My love, I'm so glad I'm here, blah, blah." And he thinks that she's a deer and shoots her right in the heart and kills her. And this is the definition of Mozartian irony, which is that we have here true love coming through as its exact opposite. The exact moment in which she recognizes the fidelity of her husband is the moment at which the love dies. In other words, the moment which he kills her. And of course, we have here a mirroring of what the beginning of the story was. At the moment that he realizes that it is true love, he has to flee from the traumatic content of love in order to prove whether or not she really loves him. And in the second part, we have the exact inverse of that story, where we have the woman who is now confronted with the traumatic core of true love, and therefore has to suspect him of infidelity and pays the price for then finding the true love. In both cases, the traumatic element of the Ovid story isn't the infidelity. In both cases, infidelity is the actual thing that keeps them alive. It's the traumatic core of love, at which point it is embraced, that spells your end. It's just in a mirror version. Of course, this is also the difference again between Tristan and Isolde, Wagner's romantic opera, and Cosi fan tutte. Within Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, we have the ultimate embrace of love in the void itself, in the fall into the abyss, in the Liebestod. And in in Mozart, we have a much more modern idea, which is that the pleasurable part of love isn't the fall into the abysmal formal content of love, but it's the skirting around the edges, the titillation, the plays, the manipulation, the game.
Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so we have two entirely different logics of what love is. Either we have love as the void that you fall into, or we have love actually being repressed, and within the repression of love we have the entire game of what it means to be alive, etc. Which brings us back to the Kantian idea of virtue, the idea of aesthetic versus ethical. The aesthetic is the idea of the void you fall into. The ethical is the idea of the void that you escape in order to create the world around you. Which also brings us back to morality. Remember, for Kant, morality is not saying we have a perfect idea of the divine good. We're acting in accordance with God. If you want to make that about love, morality isn't to say I am acting in according to pure love. Morality for Kant is everything we do to avoid confronting the traumatic truth that we don't know what God wants from us. We look at God and we say, what the fuck? And so it's up to us to try to fill in what we think is ethical through the repetition of virtuous acts, which we hope will lead us to the divine good, ergo morality. That is the ironic take that Mozart takes apropos love, which is to say love isn't this pure divine essence that you fall into. Instead, love is looking up and saying, what the fuck? And running away from it and formalizing it into lots of different evasions of the traumatic formal content of love. Which, in a weird way, if you follow these classes, actually brings us back to what we talked about in the last 2 weeks, which is why Alain Badiou, the philosopher Alain Badiou, refers to love as a truth process. For Alain Badiou, love is an event. Love occurs external to us, and in how we respond to that event, love becomes formalized. I know it's a little bit technical, and he sees that true for all philosophy, all metaphysics. What Zizek has always argued is that an event doesn't take place externally. An event takes place internally through the disavowal of the event. And here we have again the difference between Wagner and Cosi von Tutti. For Wagner, love is the event that subsumes your ego. You fall into it and you disappear almost. You are no longer yourself. It's only with the ironic distancing that we have within Cosi von Tutti that we're in the Zizek, Freud, Lacan, Marxian dimension, which is that the truth of the love isn't in the formal traumatic fall into love. The truth of the love lies in everything you do to avoid the formal consequences of that knowledge. And so we have here, in a sense, in Cosi von Tutti, the first symptomatic opera. We have a symptomatic approach to the experience of love, which is also why it's a post-romantic opera. It's once we move into Mozart's Cosi von Tutti that we start understanding why the romantic opera, in which you have a direct overlap between the formal content of love and, you could say, the content of the form, the expression of the love, starts breaking down within Cosi von Tutti. It's only within Cosi von Tutti that the elaborate manipulations and mechanisms by which we try to escape from love becomes the name of love itself, which is a much more dialectically interesting process. Now, this class has been a little bit of a standalone, because what we're trying to lead up to is the idea of Hegelian dialectics, Hegelian external reflection, why Zizek calls the Lacanian Hegelian subject the vanishing mediator, which is what I wanted to do this week. But then we saw Cosi von Tutti, and I thought we should do like a filler class on this. I think that a lot of the themes that we have here are going to be really helpful moving forward into the next class. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, this class, which we talked about opera a lot, is part of a series called The Vanishing Mediator. And we're already like 5 or 6 classes in. If you want to start here, that's totally fine. You can start with any class. They're not linear, they're dialectical. So you could literally start here and then watch last week's class or next week's class. The point is that we're trying to talk about the concept of the vanishing mediator. And the vanishing mediator is a concept from Frederick Jameson, which is a fairly technical idea by which we have a particular that becomes the catalyst for a universal. The universal then subsumes the particular into the new universal. Super technical philosophical argument that we are dedicating 12 weeks to understanding. And through understanding that, we're trying to understand some of the basic concepts within Zizek, within Freud, within Lacan, within Hegel, Kant, and so on and so forth. So if you'd like to go back to those classes, those are all saved on my IGTV. You can watch them for free. They are open access for anybody to watch. Or you can also download them on Patreon, because if you become a patron, it actually allows us to keep doing this and keep doing it for free for everybody who's joining us from around the world. So thank you very much for watching. We appreciate you starting your Monday morning with us. In about 5 minutes, we're going to continue this discussion on Discord with our Patreon community. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to pick it up on Discord, where you can ask us live questions about anything, movies, politics, romance. You can ask us anything you want on the Discord. It's going to start in 5 minutes. If you'd like to join that discussion, simply click the link in our bio and you can sign up to join there. We're going to start that in 5 minutes. If you are not watching live, if you are watching after the fact, thank you so much for watching. We hope you're having a good week. And we very much hope that you consider joining our learning community on Patreon, because it really helps us keep this project going. All right. Thank you guys so much. And until then, keep thinking like you mean it.
Like you mean it. Thanks,
Bye, guys.
everyone. Have a great week.